you heard from the introduction, I have a special interest in the smart city context. And of course, Andhra Pradesh is very well known also as one of the hubs of smart city development. And so the topic that I am going to talk today about, namely whether the smart city is also a good city and what to do with that, seemed like a logical topic. So let me try to get my slides up so that you can follow what I'm saying there. So is this fine? Everybody can see?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, this is one always has to check. It's this ritual now with all these online lectures that one is always asking whether everybody can see, but there is really no alternative to that. So as was mentioned in the introduction, my interest in the smart city is an older one, but it became really very acute to us in Tallinn when our department received a large grant to study for the European Union on a practical implementational level. The question not only how can one smart city develop, but how can smart cities relate to each other? One of the biggest problems of smart cities is that there is a tendency of these cities to turn into city-states and become autonomous, if you will, to create digital walls around themselves and to spearhead and pioneer solutions that, while helpful for the people in these cities, would not be able to transfer smoothly to close by cities in other jurisdictions or even within their own country. And this question was actually the topic of the PhD thesis of one of my students. This is the gentleman right next to me, between me and Mr. Shobichakia, who is kindly helping me with this lecture today. The person on left is our department head, Professor Caro. You see there is a certain coordination in fashion, but that is purely accidental. Anyway, so what Mr. Ralph Martin Soa wrote his PhD about, this is the gentleman right next to me, was how Tallinn and Helsinki, that means the capitals of Estonia and of Finland, both leading smart city entrepreneurs, if you will, could link up and communicate with each other, and how this could be done. In the European Union, this is a serious subject, but not only there, of course. And it's finest twins. Finest is a wordplay on Finland and Estonia, and of course, finest in the sense of best as well. And as was mentioned already, our department, to study this, received a grant of $35 million, actually a little bit more, to have a center of excellence that would deal with this subject, including large-scale pilot projects that would actually implement twinning solutions. 1.5 million each. That is not that much money on an Indian scale, but it's quite a huge money on the scale of small European countries or small, medium-sized European countries. And this is a very exciting research project in which we all are, and which allows us to think about the smart city issue, not only on an academic side, but also on an extremely practical one, because as I said, real things are to be done. But once you do that, and once you solve the issues of the smart city, you very quickly run into theoretical, ethical, moral issues, if you will. This is the case everywhere. And I do remember very well the first time I got involved with the creation of smart cities in India, and specifically on Andhra Pradesh, was when I was teaching, as was also mentioned in the introduction, at the Lee Kuan Yew School of the National University of Singapore in 2017, because that was something in which there was a direct cooperation, and it was something I was involved in. There were very many mid-career or senior Indian students there, and it was a big issue of debate, so it came up there as well. This is why I thought this might be something moderately interesting for you to listen to in such a setup as the lecture series in which we now are. So the smart city is obviously not a city with real intelligence, just like artificial intelligence is not really intelligent, but smart city is a label. And we have all kinds of possibilities to define it. But in the end, we need to look how a word is really used. That means, what does smart city signify? How is it employed by the people? What do people mean when they say smart city? And the answer to this is that almost every time the word smart city is used, is it is the ICT city. That means a city in which solutions and productive and administrative arrangements are based on information and communication technology. So it would also be possible to think about a purely ecological city that is smart, but based on wood and water alone. And that's actually a nice thought. But this is not how the concept is used. The concept is used that you use data in order to predict, to plan, to structure, to communicate, to travel, all of these things. And therefore, this leads the smart city to be a form of e-governance. That means of administration, policy, and larger political decision-making that is ICT enabled. And not only virtual, but also as far as the connection is concerned. So this is a very, very important thing of how to start. In fact, what has happened is that because smart city research and prioritizing smart cities has been such a popular topic, sometimes e-governance research that has nothing to do with enabled cities is still called smart city research. So it has occasionally become even an umbrella term for any form of e-governance research, even if it is not particularly urban. But for us, of course, for the few minutes we will share this afternoon, we will take a more proper use definition of the smart city as the ICT city, and we will look at that and not at e-governance generally. Now, there is no doubt that we live in a time that is significantly structured by ICT, and that e-governance is the most important aspect of governance today. Like it or not, people are moving into their smartphone to a considerable extent, and it is not only a source of solution, of efficiency, of effectiveness, of improvement, of reform, but it is also simply where our lives are moving towards. And if it is the lives of the people that are administered by the government, then the government needs to go along to there where the people are. In fact, most e-governance has not been spearheaded by the government, but it has been government following developments in society and economy in order to stay up with this. The government didn't start social media, and it didn't start the use of social media. But once it was there, it had to go there. If you do not go onto social media, you cannot win in most of our societies. And so the state moved in later. But for the smart city, the communication on the political level is not the main topic. The main topic is the solving of particular policy problems that occur in such a way that they arise from humans living together tightly packed in an urban environment. And here, with various forms, the smart city can solve issues, especially of traffic, of environment, and is so important to the pandemic of health. And it is possible, for instance, to classic examples would be to solve the problems of recurring traffic jams, which are a logical side of cities which build up so that a lot of people live in a certain space, so that there are simply more cars and more people on the streets than there should be. And it is very easy, relatively speaking, to have urban transit that is both cheap, efficient, but also predictable for the people, so they know when the bus is coming. It is possible to open and close certain streets knowing where the people are going, or even have smart cars that can be told that. And not all, but most traffic problems can be solved by sending cars into avenues that they didn't plan to take, but that are wise to take to get it off. Environment is, of course, the heating issue, seeing where you need a lot of air conditioner energy, where you need a lot of heating energy, depending on where you are, and directing, for instance, that apartments are not heated or cooled, but that the heating or cooling starts once the occupants arrive from work back to home, and therefore you can start already previously to cool everything down. This is a very simple example of the so-called Internet of Things, but if this is done on a global or on a city global, if you will, scale, then it can reduce CO2 emissions to an unusually high degree. And health, of course, let's just look at the difference of being able to trace COVID-19 with an app or not. That is such a jumping into your eyes example these days that we really don't need another. So this is what speaks very much for the smart city, and it is something that is very nice and that we all want. But the problem here is that there is no reason to think that once you introduce technological solutions into the human realm, things will go altogether better. History shows that while there is always improvement, there frequently, in fact, usually, are downsides as well. And the question is then, when does this downside become so serious that it may outweigh the benefits of the technological advantages? And that is something that has come up in the smart city very, very quickly. In society and technology studies, in technology theory, the usual description of that is that all technology is ambivalent. Ambivalent, a Latin word meaning bivalued, twice valued. It has a good side and a bad side. It is Janus-headed, like the Roman god Janus that you see here, with a smiling and a frowning face at the same time. So exactly what helps you also has negative effects. And this is something that entered the smart city discussion a little bit later than it usually does if we have new technologies, but it has been a very important issue. Technology is not automatically progress. This is an illustration from a Japanese movie about an engineer who is working. It's a Miyazaki movie, very, very famous one, the last of the great Miyazaki movies, animated movie, about an engineer who is so dedicated as an engineer and who works on the engineering of warplanes. And an engineer will always try to make warplanes as nice as possible. The problem is, this man works on warplanes in Japan in the 30s and 40s. And so we're talking about the kamikaze attacks and the entire use of the Japanese military in World War II, which most people, even in Japan less than anywhere else, but still would probably describe as a bad thing, not as a good thing. That means to have especially efficient bomber pilots and planes that can be steered by them is a technological advance, but for human living and human living together is certainly a negative thing. And that is one of the classical examples here. So that leaves the question remaining, when is the smart city a good city? The illustration here is of the Greek hero Oedipus, who is asked by the Sphinx a riddle, a question, to which he has to find the answer, or he will be killed. You see the bones on the bone here, on the floor here. So if you don't find the answer to the question, you will be dead. And to ask, is it automatically a good thing to create smart cities? Or do we not need a standard of the good city? That is one of the big questions in smart city research these days. The problem here is that what the smart city does, as several e-governance solutions, is that in the end it seeks total control. That means the smart city tries to predict what people do and steer them accordingly. It, in the end, tries not to have human input, but to know from the outside, as I mentioned already, where people will go and how they should therefore be driving. This is not artificial intelligence, it is just big data, but it still works extremely well. You can do this. So what the smart city tries is that here an algorithm and the people behind the algorithm look at urban human living together and tell people how to behave. So that human agency is reduced to a minimum. That and knowing what the human person is like is not an aberration of the smart city, but it is built into its DNA. This is the idea. This is the logical consequence. Yeah. So it is, if you will, a disenfranchisement of the people. And that is an issue if you don't want systems in which people are disenfranchised. So if I give intelligence to machines, and if people are kept, if you will, in a technological lull, social media are another example of that, and not engaged in the city and in public solution making, that is a model that is possible, but it's actually not the model that we have chosen, neither in Europe nor in India. So one needs to look closer at it. In fact, the enlightened individual, that means the human person that can make up their own mind and make decisions from everyday life to political decisions by themselves, is the basis of the philosophical imagination of what the human person should be like, of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. That wouldn't be particularly special, but who cares what a German philosopher 250 years ago thought about it? But it's very important because it is Kantian thought, that image of the human person, that means somebody who can and must make up their own mind, that is at the very foundation of the Western constitutional state. And the Western constitutional state is also a global Western constitutional state. The first one that we have in real politics is in America, but all the large democracies on Earth share this kind of setup. So it is not correct to describe it as Western, but as global Western, if you will. And it certainly includes, as you know, in the four biggest democracies, that doesn't only include the one that Madison designed, the US, but also Indonesia as the fourth, and of course, India. Only one of the four big nations is not a formal democracy. And so what you can see here is that the human person, to make up their own mind, is at the very core of democracy. To give people the vote, if they cannot really decide of what they want and how they want to pursue it, democracy is not a sensible form of government. So the decision-making human person is the very core of it. And so if the enlightened individual dies, so does the global Western constitutional state. And it is in the general electronic sphere, the social media, that try to do this. As the CFO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, has famously said, our task is to know what people want before they know it. and then to offer them things primarily to buy. That is a problem. That is a real problem if our entire idea was to have the deciding individual. And on the smart city level, the problem here is that if I have citizens that cannot decide where they want to drive and when to switch on their air conditioning, even if it's wrong, then the entire system breaks down. And this is where the catch is, and has often been. But why is there such a system? Why there's such a logic of, if you will, normal human disenfranchisement? The sociologist who came up with the concept of the network society, that means a society that is significantly structured by our ICT interactions with each other, is a well, some people call him Spanish. He is very much against that. He would say he's a Catalan professor who actually works in the United States, but who's from Barcelona, by the name of Manuel Castells. And he coined the concept of the network society in a big 3-volume book. And he also wrote the most significant book on communication power and the social media, called Communication Power, Oxford University Press. And so power and counterpower in the digital society, what he always suggests is to look at the cui bono, which is a Latin term that means in whose benefit is this? If we are running cities like that, is really the solving of problems the actual issue, but who is actually profiting from this? A very primitive way of putting this is follow the money, but as Castells would emphasize as well, it's not only money that needs to be followed, but also power and also other forms of personal interest. There is a self form of the technology as such. That means technology has a certain tendency. And I already mentioned that the technology in the smart city is a technology that is geared towards streamlining people and making them behave in a certain way, a way that is not bothered by humans interfering with their own views in the decision-making process. The German philosopher of technology and the poet Friedrich Georg Jünger, in a book called The Perfection of Technology, Die Perfektion der Technik, it's a German title that's almost exactly like the English title, so you can easily see it. It's already written in World War II, so it's rather old, has two interesting observations on technology here. The first is, first we use technology, then the technology uses us. It's not a tool anymore. And the second point is, technology does not serve mankind, but itself. So there is an autonomous logic in the technology to take over already. And in e-governance and in the smart city, this movement is built into the system. But the second thing is, sorry for the advanced thing, is this is the self-logic of technology. But as we said with Castells, who is actually pushing this? It's not only technology. Yeah? Technology is behind it. It has the self-logic, but who is pushing this? And so the analysis of smart city initiatives leads us to three kinds of people as archetypes, if you will. They are not pure so, but I mean, ideally speaking. And these are engineers, businessmen, and politicians as the groups that are behind the cities. The businessmen, obviously, because with predictive smart cities and so on, you can make a lot of money. And the politicians, because smart cities give you a lot of opportunity to either get into control or stay in control. What is important here is the engineers. Because for engineers, it's neither the profit motive, rightly understood, nor the power motive, although both can happen. But the issue with the engineers, as those of you who are engineers or know engineers very well, is that they go for solutions because they can. They solve something because it just works this way. There is a traffic problem, now I need to solve it. I solve it technologically. That's just like there is a bug in my software, and then I fix it. This is how engineers think. This is how engineers must think. Otherwise, technological progress is impossible. The problem is that this tends to what is called solutionism. Garage 48 is such a startup that tries to solve problems by hackathons within 48 hours. It's a very fashionable thing and very popular with the kids. The problem is solutionism. That means thinking that there are no human problems, not religious, not ethnic, not ethical, not class-wise, that cannot be solved by an app is rather naive. What Human Living Together tells us is that apps cannot solve everything, but that things need to be solved with a lot of goodwill over a long time with conversations, if you will. And that is actually something towards which you need to work. You can solve a lot of things with apps, such as COVID-19 tracing, but not everything, and some of the most fundamental issues not. Whereas the mindset of engineers, one of the three kind of people that are behind the smart city, do solve things from, if you will, the human outside, not themselves as humans as outside, but the people they are talking about. The problem is, as the Russian philosopher Berdyaev, whom you see here, has said, democracy is a conscious decision against expert rule. The entire idea of democracy is that we allow people to make up their own minds rather than being told by leading experts of how things should happen, whereas the smart city is a city of experts. Now, Singapore, that I mentioned before, and that is a smart nation because it is a city-state, as you know, 4.5 million, and also brands itself as a smart nation. Wait, I have it here, one of the, I think it was the Mid-Autumn Festival 3 years ago, under the motto, year of the lunar year of the rooster, the lioness for Singapore, that bills itself as a smart nation. And this is from a lecture last year, 13 months ago, where a Singapore senior civil servant said that agencies are coming together to deliver seamless, anticipatory, and personalized services for the citizens and businesses, and not by the citizens, for. Now, Singapore is an interesting case. It is now changing, but the idea of Singapore is that you do have an elite bureaucracy that manages the lives for the people, for them, with a consensus by the people. That means we have a large majority of Singaporeans, even if it's now the majority is declining, that trust senior civil servants to arrange the lives for them in such a way that is convenient, that is safe, that has a lot of health benefits, and so on and so on. And that is why Singapore could pioneer smart city initiatives as a smart nation very, very well, because that is not a system in which this individual making up of your own mind, as far as policy solution is concerned, is necessary. Singapore is not like this. It doesn't need that. The problem is with systems that do need that. The first of the great political philosophers at the root of all this technology and political thinking that we told about, the Greek philosopher Plato, described this state as what he calls a state of pigs. That means that you have a state. If you were a pig, you live in the mud, but it's nice. You don't have to work. You just run around. It's not particularly civilized, but you always get food. Everything is nice. But the problem of the state of pigs, if you hear this, is of course that the state of pigs is not run in the interest of the pigs in the end. The end of the pigs is to be served as lunch. And you know, the American saying, perhaps, if you don't pay for your lunch, you are the lunch. A little bit, this is the case with the social media, and a little bit that is the case with the smart cities. That means depriving humans of agency is a fundamental flaw, not only a side problem, but it is seriously a problem if we reduce life in the city from the stakeholdership of the people to an expert administered top-down technological state that tells people what to do because it is in the best interest. So, as in the first of the big movies of that kind, Metropolis, the question is whether humans are subjects or objects. And the smart city has the tendency to reduce people to being objects rather than subjects. And that is system problematic. There is 3 phrases that I'm sure you've heard that are recently very popular in the public management and policy discourse. And these are the words or terms: seamless, data-driven, and evidence-based. And until 5 years ago, they would be actually used also in Europe as something positive, delivering seamless services. That means everything is smooth. You don't have to put your things in. The state already knows. Data-driven decision-making is coming from the numbers and based on scientific evidence. The problem is that all three of these terms do not calculate in how tenuous these allegedly objective ways of coming to insight and decisions are, and how much they displace the human person as decision makers. Seamless, it is in the seams. That means when you have to put in your stuff and when you apply rather than the state does solve things for you, that you make a decision. Data-driven, data are just numbers to be interpreted. Data do not, if data drive decision making, it means people don't anymore. And that is a serious issue. And as far as evidence-based is concerned, evidence is not proof. It is, if you will, data that we use to argue in a certain way, and we therefore need to do something with them. That is why the European Union, as the first of the large political agencies, has recently moved to call this data evidence-informed. This is also, I don't have it on the slide here, why very often now we don't talk about data-driven, but data-based, which you can use then that from the evidence-based anymore, to suggest these are things with which humans do things, but that cannot do things for humans. So it is the rejoining of human agency into the political decision-making and its implementation that is the call of the hour. I will skip this slide and just mention that in the big Estonian university south of our university, Tartu, the great Semiotician, that means a professor of science system studies, Jüri Lotman, in his last book, Culture and Experiment, was saying that we are actually locked into such a system that I was just describing, a technological system that makes decisions for us. But always explosions happen, like COVID, like the Hong Kong riots, like Black Lives Matter, and so on and so on. So you think we have a predetermined path, but then things blow up. So we don't know whether the smart city as a disenfranchisement mechanism that does a lot of good solutions, but that really challenges the basis of human living together in democracy will remain. We don't know that. It may be already different next year, but it looks as if we are locked in. That means convenience is a very, very strong power, and human agency against smart city solutions that for them work, as we see in Singapore, can be very popular. Now, obviously, this lecture here, Human Resource Development Institute of Andhra Pradesh, doom and gloom of technology and the negative sides cannot be what the goal of my lecture is. But we need to be practical about it. If there is a really good side to the smart city and its solutionism, and if the smart city is necessary anyway because our world tends towards technical solutions, how do we then return human agency inside the smart city, not against the smart city, but against it? Oh yeah, the COVID as a thing. How do we return the good? And the 4 suggestions that I would like to make in the session today are code, make, talk, and pray. So these are 3 initiatives, 3 policy realms or possibilities within the smart city, not against the smart city. How you can make them, how to restore, yes, the human agency in the smart city context. Out of these, if you look at it, some seem very obvious. I will explain all 4 of them briefly. And some seem less obvious. Some people are really shocked in a public policy lecture to have the term pray. What does religion have to do here? Whereas code seems to be quite obvious. But in a few minutes, you will know what I'm trying to say. So, in a smart city, in which algorithms have a tendency to take over, and in which engineers are key decision makers. One of the things that is said why engineers can't understand that there are solutionists is because the engineer is always behind the keyboard. Engineers know how to be in control in an algorithmic government because they can look at the code, they can look at the technicalities, but we, the normal users, cannot. Yeah, but as you know, in public administration, one of the characteristics we say that all good civil service education has to have, everybody who has an MPA needs to have, is a good reading knowledge of accounting and bookkeeping. Because if you don't know how to account and bookkeep, then the accountants and bookkeepers will always win over you, because they know how policy is coded into the financial language and you don't. Yeah? The same thing with a smart city. And here it is coding directly. If you learn in school already or in college how to code, if you don't leave paradigms of e-governance and the smart city to the engineers, if we see this as a general knowledge, just like accounting and just like speaking English, then the power of those doing the actual coding is much less, and you look at them much more eye to eye. It is actually something, as you know, that always impressed me very much about India, and especially when I had my last visit to Hyderabad to the various IT colleges around. That means that the actual coding knowledge of India, and especially the Indian youth, is very unusually high. That means this is one of the countries, one of the top countries globally as far as coding abilities is concerned. Another one would be Japan. That means in which the ability to code and the possibility to teach and learn this is so high that it is actually possible to make this a requirement now or very soon. It's much less so in most parts of the European Union, although in Estonia it is the same. Make refers to what has been at my third university, Harvard, commons-based peer production, or the idea, global commons of design, knowledge, software, and culture, of groups in which people come together and propose solutions. That means in which you have citizens groups that meet primarily online and that design urban parks to whom not only decision-making, but the actual co-design of public solutions is left, and where you have a variety of institutional arrangements of how citizens not led by people from the first or second sector are coming up with solutions. The classic example of commons-based peer-produced knowledge base is Wikipedia, of course, where people voluntarily come in and create a knowledge base together. We have a lot of really good solutions of how to do this on the urban level as well, not only for grievances, not only for votes, but also for actual solutions. You can trust the people and their competences to a very large extent. So the more we have of this, that means of such solutions, of making things, making solutions, the more I have a resubjectification of previously objectivized people or people in danger of being objectivized. Talk is something that we are doing right now. There was an Estonian very important IT guy who was actually one of the leading protagonists of Estonian e-governance, and he mentioned about innovation. Well, the engineers told us that this and this solution had to be done, and we then didn't talk about it, we just did it. Sometimes people are in pain. Well, that's not correct. In the system in which we are, you need to talk about it all the time. It does slow things down, but to have a discourse about the smart city solutions, what do we actually want, what don't we want, giving people a voice, heeding them, and going a little bit slower, but based on consensus, goes a very long way. If you will, me talking to you about this and you having invited me for this lecture is exactly this thing. Because in the end, of course, you can completely reject what I'm suggesting. That's not a problem. But the point is that you consider whether this is a worth thinking about phenomenon or not. And what is meant with prey is that in which people find the most difficult in this matrix of four solutions is a colleague of mine has said, well, you could have also, or we could also use philosophize for this. This is not entirely wrong, or meditate, or what you will. But smart cities are geared towards effectiveness and efficiency on a level that is easily quantifiable and that you see on a spreadsheet. What religion allows you is to boom and zoom yourself out of the here and now and of the simplicity of equations, of solving things in an easy way. And what it always does is it reconnects you with the real questions of why we as human people live and what it means to be good. So if our original question was, is the smart city a good city? It is this kind of reflection, the moment of prayer, which gets you out of the efficiency matrix, if you will, that's not supposed to dominate, but that is working as a corrective in order to reinstall the consideration to what really matters in human lives. The most important political philosopher of the Western tradition, Aristotle, wrote a book about governing, but that book is lost. We don't have this anymore. We don't know exactly what he said there, but we have a couple of quotes in other books that are still there. And one of the quotations that was repeatedly referred to in later Greek texts is that he said that the good is the most accurate measure of all things. Yeah? It's not a quantification, but it's the good. And the point of the smart city that is more or less inevitable unless some explosion happens in human life, and that can be entirely beneficial, is to always check whether smart city solutions in the end are conducive to, helpful to, supportive of what we have defined as the good way of living together. And so it is sensible to go ahead with smart city solutions, but to always know that smart city solutions as such do not get us closer to what is better for the citizens, but that we need to check the smart city solutions according to what we define is the good. That already brings me to my end, and I'll be looking very much forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much. Yeah, I would now expect a moderator to take over again for the Q&A session. But everybody is muted except me, and I cannot talk on. I'm finished.
I request all the participants, if any questions, please post in chat box.
Raju sir, any questions? Any questions from group and officers? Chakrapani, sir.
Muted.
A question in chat box, sir. Is smart city prone to cyber attacks?
Okay, we are already going ahead with the questions on the chat. Yes, of course it is, and it is in serious ways. And there is very little that you can do against it, but this is so with all e-governance solutions. And the more you go on the electronic level, the more you have these issues. So this is something you need to think always about, and that is why cybersecurity is such an important area now of e-governance studies. We actually in Tallinn have 2 European centers, a military and a civil one, to study such cyber attacks. And it's only now becoming real. So we were thinking about this as a theoretical threat. But to give you an example, just a few days ago, I believe it was 3 days ago, for the first time, a person died in a German hospital because of a cyber attack. That means there was some hacker who invaded the inner setup of the hospital. Not clear whether just for fun or for blackmail, but anyway, they did. And if you break the electronic systems of hospitals today, modern hospitals, they are fragile, and then life support systems do not work anymore, and you cannot measure the heartbeat and the oxygen saturation and so on and so on. And if this is not only broken, but also changed in a fraudulent way, that means if for an intensive care patient you show that his oxygen is on a very high level, but it really isn't, that person will die. And that is what actually happened. That means we have actual victims of this. So this is certainly an aspect, and it is one of the things that you need to build in if you want to have resilient smart cities. We cannot base ourselves on the assumptions that everybody is nice. I think we all know that from politics, both internal and external. Wherever you can attack a good human living together, somebody will have a problem with this or will enjoy invading either for political or for financial purposes. And this is what we are seeing right now. And again, what is important here is that you have something like cyber hooligans. That means people who don't actually have a political interest, but they just do it because they can. There is a certain kind of hackers, so-called black hat hackers, who like to make a mess because they like to look at the mess. And so you can imagine them, for instance, to change traffic signals so that the cars smash into each other because they like seeing this. This is not a particularly healthy way to go at things, but we do have people like that, and some of them are rather good at the keyboard. So, of course, it's a big issue.
Ravindra garu,
yes, please kindly explain us how environmental friendly the smart city is. So this is one of the issues that has achieved the prominence in smart city research and policymaking in about the last year, not longer. But now it is at the forefront because, as you also mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, although they are a rather mid-level compromise, have become the legitimizing policy agenda on almost all levels, urban, national, and international. That means we're all supposed to comply with them, fortunately, because altogether they're good. Maybe not going far enough, but certainly in the right direction. And one of the main ways how you can create ecological sustainability, environmental friendliness, is by what is called reaping the benefits of information and communication technology for sustainable development. That means the use, in our case, of smart city ICT paradigms to be environmentally friendly. And here again, there is a collision with the initiative of people, but the smart city can measure how many emissions you make, and especially what you can avoid is the waste of energy, which leads to less energy production because less energy need, and that again leads to a reduction of CO2, which to a very large extent has become the #1 issue of environmental policy. Yeah, CO2 reduction is clearly the #1 agenda item. So if I can put high carbon intensive human activities more tailored to the actual users, I have much less waste. And it is actually the waste that is one of the biggest problems. We could tailor much better what is to be done. But to give you another example with the Internet of Things, you have one of the biggest carbon problems through food production and food consumption. But a lot of food, especially in the global north, actually goes wasted. The production of that, if we would waste less food than we actually do and not produce that food that is wasted, our CO2 record would look incredibly better. To really see how much people actually need and how much they actually consume, and therefore to guide people into buying what they need rather than more on an empirical basis is a classic way, if this is done on a larger scale, not individually, but for everybody living in a certain area, how you can have a reaping of smart city IT benefits for the Sustainable Development Goals, for environmental friendliness. The problem remains if this is done for the people, so people don't change mentally towards the Sustainable Development Goals, but they are allotted state-prepared things for that. So while this is an important element, again, educating people and giving them agency and following up on that education in the context that I tried to line out in my lecture is as, if not more important. But the gearing of the smart city towards environmental friendliness is certainly a key aspect today of smart city development.
Mr. Dreshla, this is Chakapani.
Yes. Sir.
I thought I'll try to elicit from you the role of IT in the containment of corona in China vis-a-vis the rest of the world. China, I think right from the beginning, with all its very closed structures, I think has been able to do a better job making use of IT, and of course a lot of coercion is also there. Do you think in times like this, probably there should be enough within the legal framework in the constitution and otherwise, empowering the governments to bring in greater regulation through the IT? I think China has proved to the world how it is able to contain whatever method. One may differ, but I think the scale and impact of the damage to the economy is much less in China than in the rest of the world.
Maybe, because we really don't know how the Chinese economy looks, because the Chinese government controls what we know about the economy of China. Yeah. Now, this is a really interesting thing, and as you know, highly contested. And I am one of my areas of knowledge or expertise, whatever you want to call it, is Chinese administration and Chinese administrative principles. So what I would
I
say
remember you
is,
spent a lot of time in China.
yeah,
Yeah.
and yes, and this remains today. My last publication was about this issue, actually. The thing is that for China, government limitations to regulation of the pandemic don't exist. The Chinese government can do whatever it wants. There are no firewalls between the administration and the government at all. That means when in China something is seen as a national priority, this can and will be done. There are no safeguards of the people towards the government. That is not the thinking. China is not a state of law. China does not have, nor did it ever have, an independent judiciary. There is no concept in Confucian thinking about judges that are separate from the government. The judges are part of the government. Yeah, this is a completely different system. So, whereas on the other hand, the outbreak in China can be explained from classic Chinese public management principles, including the so-called mandate of heaven. In China, if a physical disaster happens, it is the fault of the civil servant in charge of the area. That is not so in the West. If a flood happens in the West, that's a natural catastrophe. But in classical Chinese tradition, it means the heaven is not with the department head anymore. So this is why in the beginning in Wuhan, the bureaucrats and the party people reacted so panicky. You can redeem yourself, you can solve it. There is a famine, you're a good bureaucrat, you solve the famine. That's okay. But if you can't solve it, it's your fault. And in the Chinese tradition, up to the emperor, if something is your fault, you either get fired or executed. So the penalty for being a bad bureaucrat in China, in the Chinese tradition, is the highest in the world. Yeah, it's the only system in which the respect for senior civil servants is very high as long as they deliver. But if they don't deliver, they're literally dead. So this is a very different system that explains both why in the beginning there was this unreported outbreak and why then the state really hit on it. Not containing the coronavirus would have discredited the Xi Jinping government completely. So they needed to put everything in, and there were no limitations. The cat, as you say, is out of the bag, but the cat, as far as using IT to control the people in China, has also been there before. The entire idea of social credits, of cameras and face identification. The ideal in Beijing is if you say something bad on social media, the police will have you physically in 20 minutes in Beijing. So as soon as you write something bad on a hacked Facebook account, they will catch you. This is an entirely different attitude. It is very efficient. It may well be the model of the future, but it is not the model of the future of India or Germany or Estonia. It's another one. And it's something we need to consider, but also something we need to know. So this is what I think there. I would also say that the handling of the coronavirus in China has been IT-based, but not particularly IT-based. I do think the strong administrative and coercive capacity of the state has been at the root of the success. Not how this was done, but that it was done and that there was this super high level of state capacity. And that would be my answer to this complex and very, very interesting questions.
I agree with you, Mr. Dressler, but then you have the very strange paradox of the United States, which has the best of probably health infrastructure, ultimately grappling with the highest number of deaths on account of corona, which means what? Ultimately, there is a gap between the structure and the capacity of the structure to deliver in times of pandemic. So yeah, sorry, please go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. Actually, yesterday, two very senior public policy experts, including Professor Howlett, who was at Singapore when I was there and who's now back in Canada, who's the most cited public policy scholar. He has an essay of what kind of capacities seem to have really worked well as far as COVID-19 is concerned. And so you have an arrangement of various factors, and you're doing relatively well if more of them are positive. COVID experience, health infrastructure, as you mentioned, administrative capacity, IT enabledness, they're all part of this. Yeah. And this is why we all together see that the best responses are from high capacity Confucian bureaucratic systems, including or outside of China. So Taiwan is probably the number one, South Korea is very high, and so on and so on. And some of the European countries are doing well as well. Now, America, well, first of all, America has a very good health infrastructure for rich people. It's like Thailand. I enjoy the hospitals in Bangkok more than the hospitals here in Germany, but only if you're rich. Then it's great, but the mass health is not particularly great. The same thing is in America. America has the leading hospitals. Deaconess Beth Israel, which is my university hospital at Harvard, and to which I can go because I'm a Harvard faculty member. It's probably one of the 3 best hospitals in the world. Is really good. Is perfect. If you have a certain kind of cancer, they are able to help you more than probably all other hospitals in the world. But you also have to pay $850,000 for that therapy. And if you don't have it in the American system, that's just too bad. And then there is another issue. So the health infrastructure is not really broad enough. It's very finance-based. It's very good on the top, but then it thins out. The next question I see on the chat, I want to include these to your answer. Is it possible to put forward the concept of smart cities in developing countries like India with many others visible challenges? Now, the first person with whom I discussed Indian public policy reform, and this was in Australia, I was on a panel with him, was an Indian public policy expert that many of you will know. His name is Shashi Tharoor. And he is famous of saying that India is not a developing country. India is a highly developed country with a lot of problems. That is an interesting thing, because I think, whether this is true of India or not, I think it is definitely true about the United States of America. This used to be a very high capacity, very well working country, but it's in a deep crisis. And it has a government that has almost voluntarily decapacitated the bureaucracy that would be in charge of COVID responses. So you don't have the health that is so great. You have a bureaucracy that by its setup is not bad, but that internally has really been eroded, and so on and so on. And then, of course, one of the elements that Michael Howlett has identified as important for the COVID response, and that is dynamic leadership on the top government level. Yeah, that somebody takes reasonable, timely initiative. And that is what we fortunately had in Germany, and that is what we certainly had in the entire leadership, say, in Taiwan and in South Korea. And that is what we didn't have in the United States and the United Kingdom at all, because the government leadership, never mind what your party politics are, in the US and the UK are very incompetent on the policy and policy-making level. So they're waffly, they're in, they're out. There's, oh, you don't have to wear a mask. Yes, you do, maybe not. You know, there is no clear, strong leadership. And that is an issue that if you add lack of leadership, decapacitating of the public sector, and a lacking broad health infrastructure for all, then you get a sum that doesn't surprise me, that the reaction against COVID in the US was as weak as it is, and why in the end they will probably get the highest number of deaths. It certainly looks right now that way.
It's a little strange because the British Prime Minister himself was a victim of COVID. He virtually came out of the jaws of death. But it's very difficult to understand that, as you said, the tentative functioning of the government. I mean, I'm really amazed at this.
It's my second professorship is at University College London, and the debate on how the government does as far as the bureaucracy is concerned, this is what I literally spend a certain time every day about, because it remains a mystery how in a country like that this can be. And as you said, Mr. Johnson was in the hospital. He was really even in intensive care, came out, and it's such a mess. For me, to give you the IT example, the COVID-19 app, the tracing app in Britain, Britain has a national health service, as you all know, nationalized health. But the development of national health tracing app was left to private firms, to two private firms for money. They got a lot of money and they created the app, but it's one of the latest apps in the world. Actually, it came out just a few days ago. The first wave is already done, and now finally the Brits have a tracing app. But the key for tracing apps is that if somebody is positive, the people that person has met knows that they have been in the vicinity of somebody who has been positive. But if you go to the National Health Service in Britain and you test for COVID and you get a negative or positive result, you cannot put that information into the app. It's impossible. Only if you get your tests for money outside of the national health can you put your results into the app. It's one of the biggest, most stupid catastrophes in COVID policy response that we have. And so what you see here is that a government that is falsely, I would say, prioritizing privatization and giving tasks to a second sector that is allegedly better, that leads to catastrophic results. A COVID tracing app that doesn't tell you whether you have met people who have tested positive is more than stupid. It is lethal because it keeps you thinking that you have not been exposed while you have. And so this is what I would say about the UK government right now. And I think this is also the consensus, even in the Tory-friendly press in Britain, that this has been a complete disaster. And it's very interesting for us because I mentioned from the beginning the tracing app as a typical smart city example. So the British example is one of how you can do it wrongly.
Thank you. Wonderful. Any other questions?
Well, I still should answer the question, is it possible to put forward the smart city in developing countries? Because I only cited it. And that is, of course, an issue. But one of my answers here is it depends if the smart city is an IT-enabled city. We do have countries that are called either threshold or development that have relatively high administrative capacity and relatively high IT competences, and for instance, a high distribution of mobile phones in the population. Now, while you have that, you cannot perhaps build certain infrastructures that other smart cities have, but you can build some, and perhaps the most important ones. Once again, I do think that while not on any level, but the way that IT as such is handled in India, I see India as an obvious country to solve smart city challenges. But to give you another example of a country that is generally not seen as a first world country, yet that has done very well in the pandemic and that combines high administrative capacity and IT solutions, this would be Vietnam, which is one of the leading 10 countries in COVID and which has a very good Confucian, not Buddhist bureaucracy and a very high smartphone penetration, and which does that rather well. So I think that the answer is yes. You need to pick and choose, but less first worldy countries are in just a good position to use smart city solutions that those which are not. And in fact, the largest number of smart cities in the world, or the highest, if I look at all smart cities that exist and that are called smart cities, the majority is not anymore in the global West. Yeah, so definitely, as far as that is concerned.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Dreshla. Wonderful having you. I know it's a little too early for you to be disturbed, but this is the best of time.
Oh, it's not early at all. It's